Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A few days ago, Joseph Nye died, a U.S. international affairs scholar, very distinguished, got a lot of press. He is the apostle and the inventor of the idea of U.S. soft power. One of the more thoughtful obituaries was from my old friend Edward Luce, the U.S. Editor and columnist from the Financial Times, who not only noted a sad farewell to Joseph Nye, but also to U.S. soft power itself. And thinking of Nye and soft power, one also thinks of hard power, the opposite of Nye. The man who most comes to mind when you think of U.S. hard power is, of course, Henry Kissinger, a proponent of U.S. foreign policy hard power for generations. But we think less of his, I don't know whether you call him his alter ego, his great frenemy, a man called Zbigniew Brzezinski, who, like Kissinger, has been a long-time player, no longer around, in American foreign policy. And I'm thrilled that Ed Luce, who, of course, writes for the Financial Times, has a new book out on Brzezinski. It's called Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Cold War Prophet. Ed is joining us from America's Center of Hard Power, Washington, D.C., where he lives and operates as the FT US guy. Would it be fair, Ed, to call Brzezinski an operator, a thinker about American hard power, in contrast to Joe Nye?
Well, first of all, thanks, Andrew, for having me on. Great to see you and to talk about my new book. It's a good question. I think what Joe Nye did when he coined that term soft power was he put a name to something that people felt was there but can't really be measured. So Brzezinski was a scholar, a Sovietologist, at Harvard, at Columbia, then moved to Washington, worked for LBJ's, Lyndon Johnson's administration, ran the foreign policy side of Hubert Humphrey's ill-fated 1968 presidential campaign, the one that Nixon won, and then appointed Henry Kissinger afterwards, of course. And then he became Jimmy Carter's national security advisor in 1977. And what he stood for and the advice he gave to presidents was a combination of hard power and soft power. And I think that would tally very well with what was happening in the 1970s, the face-off between the Soviet Union and the United States. American soft power was beginning to surge again after years of sort of languishing because of the Vietnam War, because of stagflation, because of Watergate, and the Soviet Union had caught up with the United States over that period on a nuclear basis. So there was an equal balance of terror. And by the late 70s, that really began to switch. America was out of Vietnam. It was clear the Soviet Union was stagnating, and the US was in the technological lead again, which had been in doubt. And so I think Brzezinski, without using the term soft power, was very aware of, the switch going on and how to make the most of it and put the Soviets on the back foot by championing human rights, samizdat, freedom of movement and expression behind the Iron Curtain. That is a classic use soft power. But your question was right. He was also an exponent of hard power, no doubt about that.
Ed, your two last books were both big hits. The Retreat of Western Liberalism, a massive bestseller, one of the first books to talk about the crisis of liberalism in the West, and then Time to Start Thinking, America in the Age of Dissent, which is an early book about the crisis in contemporary America, and you're on the front lines of this. This new book is somewhat different. It took, I think, 5 years of serious research, as you noted before we went live. It requires a lot of hard work, a lot of archival work. I wonder whether you personally feel you have a little bit in common with Zbig. You yourself are from a notable English aristocratic family. He was a Polish aristocrat. Do you feel you have much in common with him?
I love talking to you, Andrew, because you ask questions others don't ask, and that's not what I've contemplated before. I wouldn't really say I'm an aristocrat. I think one branch of my...
You sound like one.
But you know, voices can be deceptive. No, I've come from a privileged background, no doubt about it.
And I don't mean that in an accusatory, critical way.
I wasn't taking it like that. Don't worry, Andrew. I was trying to sort of pass it literally. Brzezinski did come from Polish nobility, which is slightly misleading. Slacher, they're called, and it's about 10% of Poland's population, so much larger than, you know, your definition of nobility in other European countries. And he was a foreigner, and he kept his accent, and you know, he was a controversial figure, and he dealt it out. You know, if he got into a fight, it was a knockdown fight, and he made a lot of enemies. I don't think I've made quite so many enemies, but I am a foreigner in Washington, an outsider, sort of insider after 20 years here now. But my accent hasn't changed a jot, and I did get to know him, and I did like I appreciated his sharp elbows and his blunt talking. And his impatience with the sort of legalese, bullet point, blow-dried talk that you do hear quite a lot of in Washington, D.C. And so maybe, you know, I felt some sort of kindred spirit there with his way of communicating and operating, which was blunt.
He seems to have brought his aristocracy, he's exported it to the United States. His daughter is a very prominent MSNBC columnist. She has her own show, of course. You've been on the show many times. His son, Mark, I think, was an ambassador to Poland, ironically enough. Did he bring those aristocratic values to the United States? I mean, America is, of course, founded against the idea of aristocracy. The American dream is designed to challenge the principles of aristocracy. We know that's never always realized in fact. But was he an exporter of European aristocratic ideals, which makes him not that unusual in the history of America? And it began, of course, with Tocqueville, who many people still see as being the smartest observer of American life.
Yeah, again, it's an interesting question. I mean, in terms of his belief system, he was a strong believer in the American creed, in meritocracy, and in the people he hired to the White House. It was a very meritocratic process. He didn't really choose on the basis of somebody's views. He wanted to assess the quality of their intellect. I mean, he was a seriously intelligent person, you know, top of his class all the way through his life. So I think he believed in the aristocracy of the intellect. You know, was pretty impatient with people he saw as fools, and was really very admiring of people he saw as intelligent, even if they had diametrically opposing views. So, of course, when you write a biography, you really are intruding into people's personal life. And you know, I know he was a very tough parent with his 3 kids. Mika, who you just mentioned, the Morning Joe co-host, Ian, and Mark, who you also just mentioned, who was Biden's ambassador to Poland. they had a tough upbringing, and he brought with him that sort of Central European, old worldish, we call it aristocratic if you like, quite strict expectations. There was no sort of fake praise from him. And as an academic, by the way, at Harvard, Columbia, he gave 1 A per class. However big the class was, it could have been 40 people, only 1 A per class. So he was the opposite of grade inflation.
Yeah, we need more of him these days, especially in California, where everyone gets an A. Who were his heroes? I mean, in terms of contemporaries, Soros comes to mind as a Central European who made it big. Who were his great intellectual heroes? I mean, was he well read in, I don't know, Thucydides, Machiavelli? What were his intellectual foundations?
So he was a political scientist, but who then became a Sovietologist, a fluent Russian speaker, as well as being a fluent Polish and reasonable German. His intellectual influences were mostly American. They were people like Carl Friedrich, who was a grand figure, and a scholar of totalitarianism at Harvard. He loved Barrington Moore, who again was another brilliant.
And Huntington as well, of course, who was sort of in some ways the other of Barrington Moore.
That's absolutely correct. And in fact, he was lifelong friends with Huntington. They were the same age, had similar academic careers. But in fact, he brought Huntington into the White House while he was there, and he was known as Zbig's Zbig. Because he was, the strategic thinker inside the national security staff. But his influences are not primarily European. His sort of pet hates intellectually were Karl Marx and various sort of Russian romantics. So, I think he's actually more of an American mind with a very European sensibility, but more of an American intellectual mind than you would have thought listening to his accent.
Yeah, so he wasn't well versed, for example, in his fellow Polish thinker Kolakowski's history of Marxism. He just intuitively, as a Pole, as someone who was opposed to the Soviets, hated Marxism. Did he credit it with any value at all, or he just wrote the whole thing off as pure totalitarianism?
Oh no, he was a scholar of it. He read it all and wrote about it, and his book, Soviet Bloc, Unity and Conflict, which was really his great contribution as a scholar. That was, I think Foreign Affairs listed its top 100 books of the 20th century, and it was one of the highest. It was very, very influential book. So he was a cutting edge Sovietologist, and he knew his Marx and his Lenin and his Trotsky and his Stalin pretty well. But no, I don't think he was influenced by them. I think he was, a Cold War intellectual warrior, to put it one way.
A hardcore hawk. So was he in the camp of Richard Pipes, Robert Conquest, those types of people?
Not as far. No, he wasn't on the right. He was for the most part a Democrat throughout his life, and he was a critic of Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles' operation of rollback, of liberating communist occupied countries from Moscow. He was an opponent of that. He thought it was reckless. Oh, he also thought it was hollow. But he was also a critic of Kissinger's détente, which was, the relaxation of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. He said that the Soviets were using that cover, that sort of insurance card against a nuclear conflict with the United States, to promote third world revolution. And so adventurism, he believed, was the price of détente, and that it was too high a price to pay. So détente ended under Carter, and it ended under Carter because of Brzezinski.
You mentioned that he was a strong meritocrat. What was his thinking about America? I guess a meritocrat believes in the American dream. One can imagine the young Brzezinski sailing into New York Harbor, past the Statue of Liberty. Did he romanticize America? Did he see it in a unique sense?
Not really, to be honest. I think he appreciated America and was enormously pleased of his own success and very much benefited from what was, I think, a better working or a less badly working meritocracy in the post-war era in the 50s, 60s. He really was an upwardly mobile immigrant. So he appreciated America. I think he saw it as the sort of only bulwark against totalitarianism during the Cold War with its allies. But he wasn't an American exceptionalist. I mean, he didn't sort of sign up to this sort of providence-based view that America is somehow uniquely blessed by, by providence and by God, and that, therefore it somehow stands apart from history. It's different, exceptional. He didn't sign up to that at all. And after the end of the Cold War, during which he'd been the optimist for America, and really, unlike Kissinger, who was a real pessimist, Brzezinski believed America was winning the cultural battle, the political battle, the technological battle, and the economic battle. So, which is, and finally the military sort of got a military lead. So the combination of soft and hard power. But after the end of the Cold War, he became very pessimistic about it, uncharacteristically pessimistic about America, and believed it was going to really suffer from its own triumphalism and hubris, and it would be resented by what he called, in this book he wrote in 1993, Out of Control, what he called America's hubris. He would. That it would bring into being what he called the alliance of the aggrieved. And that meant China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, countries that felt they were on the losing side of history and being provoked, disrespected, belittled, looked down on by the United States. And I think that that forecast was based on pessimism about what was happening internally in America. And I think it was also quite prescient. It was quite prophetic.
In a way, but in an odd way. You were just on the Steve Bannon show. Could Zbig have ever imagined that America would join that council of the disaffected, as you put it?
I think he would have been really quite startled. He died about 3 months after Trump was inaugurated for his first term. So he was aware of, and he was perfectly compos mentis, a bit slower, but he was 89 and was still reading voraciously. So he was aware of Trump. But I don't think anybody then realized quite the extent to which Trump would become Trumpian in a second term. And no, I don't think he would have expected America to deviate that dramatically. But he's in good company. I don't think there are too many who would have forecast this.
What was he most troubled with then about America? Not foreign policy, not outward looking, but inward looking. Race, inequality, capitalism, alienation, the coastal elites. What most bothered him about America in terms of making it a better place for his children and grandchildren?
Well, so on domestic policy, he was less sophisticated on that than foreign policy. But he had a number of critiques. One was inequality. I mean, he's very clearly a Democrat. He was clearly on domestic policy on the left. But it didn't really matter that much because his jobs were in foreign policy. But for what it's worth, he had many critiques. One was economic, that this was an unfair system where meritocracy was breaking down. Two, and things like infrastructure was becoming second world. It was really degenerating America. Two, he had a spiritual critique. Now, he wasn't really a deep believer. He was raised a Catholic, but he had this great relationship with Pope John Paul II, who was also Polish.
Yeah, you wrote a good piece for the Times a couple of weeks ago, the dinner that helped save Europe, about a dinner he had with John Paul II when he visited America in 1979. Might have saved the world in an odd kind of way.
Yes, I mean, that was, And we can get onto that if you like, because that's the sort of big thing that he hasn't really been given credit for, the non-invasion of Poland. But just to finish the sort of thought on, he and the Pope shared this view that there was a sort of spiritual degrading going on in Western societies, and that this sort of worship of greed, but also social permissiveness. So some of this is sort of from a sort of center-right social Catholic point of view. And that this was a sort of termites eating the building from within sort of phenomenon, that was undermining the sort of morale and the mores of America and other Western cultures. And so that was a social critique. He was pessimistic about America, I think, for fairly good reasons. If you look at the various books he wrote late in life in the early 2000s.
What would he have made then of this Catholic critique of America, conservative Catholic critique by Bannon, of course, Patrick Deneen, J.D. Vance? Would he have shared some of their concerns?
No, I think he sort of lost. I think he became an agnostic, as he got older. And so the schism that Bannon talks about being provoked by Cardinal Prevost's election as Pope, as Leo XIV, he would not be on the be on the sort of right reaction side that Bannon and Vance and others are on. I think he sort of drifted into a sort of church-going agnosticism as his life went on. One of the things I discovered, that the family didn't know, or most of the family didn't know, was that his brother, almost twin, about 11 months younger, Adam Brzezinski, he'd committed suicide in New York in the 1950s, and Brzezinski had to go down and deal with the ghastly scene, and he committed suicide, and he was gay as well. And so from their parents, Brzezinski's parents' point of view, particularly his mother, who was very, very sort of doctrinaire Catholic, this was a family crisis, and they kept it quiet for that reason, because suicide is a mortal sin. Brzezinski did not consider it a mortal sin. He wasn't a homophobe. I'm guessing here because I don't think he expressed a view, but I'm sure he'd have been in favor of things like ending celibacy amongst Catholic priests and bringing women into the priesthood. I'm sure he would have been on the Pope Francis side of that debate.
You describe him, obviously quite rightly, as one of the high priests of American Sovietology, very distinguished man, in and out of academia, in and out of government. But the US ultimately got the Soviet Union wrong, Ed, at least in my view. The system collapsed almost overnight. No one, or very few people, predicted it. Would Brzezinski have accepted that? Would have he accepted a degree of intellectual responsibility for getting the Soviet Union wrong as such an influential player, both within academia and government?
No, I disagree with you on this. He'd been predicting the Soviet Union's demise for decades. He talked about the gerontocracy in the 60s, the dictatorship of the clerks. He used this term, reverse natural selection, that the Soviet system only promoted people who were not innovative and not creative, who were least imaginative, and therefore it was going to collapse under its own sort of moribund state. And he's had this other insight, which was since a student with student thesis at McGill in Montreal, Canadian University, 1950 student thesis, which is called Russo-Soviet Nationalism. And it kind of sketches out his line for the remainder of the Cold War, now that the next 50 years, that the Achilles heel of the Soviet Union is its suppressed nations within. So not just, the so-called captive nations in the Warsaw Pact, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., but the nations within the Soviet Union, such as Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and of course, Ukraine. So he had a really, stellar predictive record on the Soviet Union, and he operationalized that when he was Carter's national security advisor. Solidarity movement, the trade union movement, was something he was in very close touch with, and it really bore out his view of how you peacefully undermine the Soviets. You awaken its nations, and that's where his Polishness gave him real insight. So I think I disagree with you on that. I think he had a stellar predictive record.
And then that dinner that helped save Europe, that the essay you wrote for the New York Times about the dinner he had with John Paul II, does that support the thesis that he understood the long-term crisis of the Soviet Union?
Well, so what happened in 1980? Of course, Solidarity, Lech Walensa's trade union movement, had just grown up, spread like wildfire in August 1980. And was a mortal challenge to the Soviet Union, because this was not a communist group. This was outside the official, designated group, trade union, which was docile and pro-communist. This was a trade union movement that attracted 10 million members, more than a quarter of Poland's population by the end of 1980. Extraordinary wildfire, mushrooming everywhere. And its icon was the Pope, which was a source of real confusion to Moscow, because it was a working class movement, a trade union movement, and yet it had the Catholic Church at its heart. And so this was a mortal threat.
And of course, he was a Polish Pope, which...
Yes, he was a Polish Pope.
Which was the all-important fan.
And so the Soviets amassed 18 divisions on Poland's border. And remember, of course, they had invaded Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring in 1968. And this looked like a hat trick was coming. They were now going to invade the much larger country, much more significant one of Poland. And those 18 divisions, it wasn't just that they were on the border, it's that they'd set up emergency hospitals all around Poland's border, including on the East German side. So of those 18 divisions, 2 were East German. Now imagine if you're Polish, and the thing you most remember is the Nazi-Soviet pact and the invasion from the east and the west of Poland on September the 5th, 1939, extinguishing their nation, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And you've suddenly, again, 40 years later, you've got the East Germans on one side and the Russians. In your mind, you see them as Russians, not Soviets, about to invade again. And so this would have been a mega crisis. And the relationship that the Brzezinski had with the Pope in Rome was it conducted in Polish, and I got the correspondence between them, really interesting correspondence, and conducted over the telephone. And they talked so much that Brzezinski had P for Pope put in on his White House phone. He had a Vatican hotline, and they persuaded.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
It really is. It's one of those little details that makes a biography such an enjoyable experience to write. The color, the 2 of them, in coordination with intensive conversations with people in the Solidarity movement, including Lech Walensa in Gdansk at the Lenin shipyard, which was the sort of ground zero of Solidarity, persuaded them to tamp down their rhetoric so that the Soviets didn't feel so provoked into invading. But at the same time, they made it clear to the Soviets, a slightly different message to Moscow, that if the Soviet Union did invade Poland, it would be indigestible. It would be a porcupine. They would face workers, church, intellectuals, and probably a rebellion by the Polish army, none of which really happened with Hungary or Czechoslovakia. And they succeeded. The Soviet Union withdrew its divisions. And a year later, martial law was declared by one of the Polish leaders, Jaruzelski, but that was to prevent the next attempted invasion. So the invasion never happened. And I know history doesn't thank you for what didn't happen, but I think that, a lot of the reason Soviets didn't invade was because of that relationship between the Pope and Brzezinski, really a very unusual.
Yeah, and it makes you rethink Stalin's famous comment when he asked, I can't remember, was it Churchill or Roosevelt or one of his generals, about how many divisions the Pope has in one of his post-war discussions. Although again, an account of narrative, Ed. Vladimir Putin would have been a very young KGB officer then. I mean, he was young when he was in Dresden in '89. I guess, in retrospect, guys like Putin would probably think it was a mistake for the Russians not to have invaded Poland in '80.
Quite plausibly. I mean, Putin did say the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. By that, I think he meant the Russian Empire.
It's interesting to reimagine had the Russians invaded. You mentioned that the Soviets probably didn't invade, partially because of Brzezinski's clever diplomacy, partly because they were a gerontocracy. I think you know Harold James, the Princeton historian. He wrote an interesting piece a couple of years ago suggesting that late or early 21st century America in the 2020s and the late Soviet Union have a lot in common in terms of a gerontocracy. Do you think Brzezinski would have felt that had he been around now to see these elderly politicians, whether it's Trump or Biden or Pelosi, make so many errors and undermine America more and more?
Yeah, you know, I mean, there are some similarities between America in the 2020s and the Soviet Union in the 1970s under Brezhnev. You know, they look like sort of wax figures sometimes, those pictures of the Politburo. And Brezhnev was semi-comatose. I mean, he was on so many drugs, his mind wasn't clear. Drugs for his medical treatment, I should add. But he also was a heavy drinker, vodka, often drunk, slurred his words. They kept him out of view. And, you know, I don't think Biden's ever been drunk. He's a teetotaler. You know, he hasn't got a serious medical condition as far as I know, but clearly his appearances were minimized all through his presidency of those 4 years. His appearances, he was rationed, and it was very scripted. And I think that really contributed to a sense of ancien regime that you know, was so damaging to Kamala Harris's campaign. But I don't know, you know, I don't think America is technologically stagnant. I mean, clearly there's a lot of technological change going on. So I wouldn't overstate that parallel. And I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of young people waiting in the wings. J.D. Vance is Trump's obvious heir apparent. He's only 40, I think. And there are some younger Democrats coming up. So I wouldn't overstretch that parallel, but it's a useful one to think of.
Finally, Ed, you clearly wrote this book because you're a big admirer, because you wanted to study some very interesting history. But as the FT's America guy writes about contemporary America, I'm guessing that you wrote the book to try and teach us a little bit about contemporary and future America. As we speak, Donald Trump is, according to the New York Times, who is a great admirer of him, making a splash in Saudi Arabia. What does Zbigniew Brzezinski, his life, his successes, perhaps even some of his failures, what do they teach us about the America of the late 2020s in terms of perhaps reestablishing or maintaining its great power status? What does it tell us in particular about this new Cold War with China?
Let me just mention one. I think it's a great question. Let me just mention one blunder. I mean, he had many blunders, you know, and this isn't a hagiography. But I do admire Brzezinski, but this is a biography, warts and all. And his blunder on Iran, where he was kind of as ignorant on Iran as was Carter. But Brzezinski was as ignorant on Iran as he was knowledgeable about the Soviet Union. And that showed, and they really screwed up. And the hostage crisis arguably, you know, led to Reagan's victory. Maybe there were a couple of other reasons, but it led into Carter being a one-term president. So I think what we should apply about Brzezinski to today goes back to that point I made earlier about how he was a jarring, discordant voice in the 90s when everyone else was triumphalist. He was he was making some pretty dire warnings, and people didn't want to hear that. And what he said was, we've spent, decades studying the Soviet Union and studying China and studying our adversaries to better understand them, learning their languages, thinking and dreaming sometimes, in the case of people like Brzezinski, in Russian, or George Kennan, the father of containment. And now that we've won the Cold War, or not lost it, and now that it's over, we're saying, we don't need to study you anymore. It's your turn to study us, because we, America, are at the top of the ladder. And your job, rest of world, is to come up this ladder by asking us, how you step up a ladder, and we'll show you and we'll tell you. And it's called the Washington Consensus for Economics, which he was a big critic of. And it's called the Liberal International Order, although the term wasn't in use then, which is American hegemony in terms of foreign policy. He disliked this. He saw it as astrategic. And I think, he had a point. We need to study countries around the world. We need to think and speak their languages. We need to sort of understand their motivations, the better to avoid conflict. And to understand, and this is what Brzezinski got into in the real evening of his life, to understand that whatever our differences with China or Russia, we're not going to have a ghost of a chance of fixing the problems humanity faces in common unless we have a modus vivendi with them. And that was a really striking sort of, for this Cold War hawk, that was a really striking line he began to take towards the end of his life. That's what I would apply from Brzezinski to today.
So we can end where we began with Joe Nye's death. Maybe we can summarize Zbig, not just America's Cold War prophet, but a prophet of what? Hard, soft power, Ed?
I'd say a prophet of geopolitics, which is a mixture of the two. It's hard and soft. But just somebody with a really good predictive record. It's worth paying attention to somebody. They have to have some method that makes them, good at forecasting.
Well, it's a great book. I'm in the middle of it. Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Cold War Prophet, by one of America's great observers, Ed Luce. Congratulations, Ed. And I'm still looking forward to getting you back on the show to talk more America, because you have one of the more original takes on it. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to be on. Thank you.